Coming up on Tech News Weekly, Jason Howell and I have a fantastic show planned for you. First, we talk to Emily Mullin from Medium's Elemental publication about at-home coronavirus testing. Is it coming? Is it not? What does the FDA say? There's a lot to learn there. Then we talk to Mehreen Kasana of Input Mag about Zoom. Have you heard of it? You know, that application everybody's using? Well, there's attention tracking. There are privacy concerns. There's so much you need to know about there so you know whether your data is being collected and exactly how. Before we round things out with a big interview, we have the founder and product manager of Google Podcasts. It's Zack Reneau-Wedeen, who is here to talk to us about the new features for Google Podcasts and its launch on iOS. This is a fantastic show you're not going to want to miss, so stay tuned and check it out. Tech News Weekly is brought to you from TWiT's LastPass Studios. Stay in control when it comes to your company's access points and authentication. LastPass makes enterprise-level security simple. Check out lastpass.com/twit to learn more.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is Tech News Weekly, episode 126, recorded Thursday, March 26th, 2020.
Hello and welcome to Tech News Weekly, the show where every week we talk to and about the people making and breaking the tech news. I am Mikah, Sargent, here from my home studio.
And I'm Jason Howell from my home studio corner.
Wait, there we go. I have to look.
You want to call it a nook?
The Tom Nook, as it were.
doing what I can. All right, we got a lot to talk about. Let's jump in.
All right, let's do it. So as we all are at home, or many of us are at home, one of the things that I've seen actually recent reports coming up kind of discussing is how we work to limit exposure to healthcare professionals and to folks who need to be sort of staying at home for the sake of their the high risk folks and what that might entail. And so one of the ways they're looking at it, one solution could potentially be at-home testing for the for COVID-19, for the exposure to the coronavirus. And it may be on its way, but there are some issues before we get there. Luckily, we have Emily Mullin here from Medium to talk to us about this. And we are so excited to have you here, Emily. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's kind of dig into this, of course. One of the first things that kind of came to mind was there are at-home tests for different things. You can do at-home tests for, say, cholesterol level. I've seen at-home tests for STIs. You send them in and they sort of process them in the lab. What does an at-home coronavirus test look like? What does it entail? How does it compare to sort of the other ones out there? Are we drawing blood? Are we providing stool samples? What is it that we do here?
Right. So the idea behind these tests is that you would do a nasal swab or a cheek swab and collect some cells from the inside of your cheek or nose. And it's important to note that these tests aren't available right now to purchase. You can't just go online and buy a test, but there are a couple of tech startups that want to do this. A couple of the companies that are looking into this, one is called Carbon Health, another is NewRx. These two companies are both based in the San Francisco area. NewRx is known for being a provider of on-demand birth control. Carbon Health is a primary care startup. There's another company out of Austin, Texas called Everlywell that provides a lot of these at-home tests. And all these companies think that at-home testing for the coronavirus, the new coronavirus, could be a way to, as you said, help limit exposure to healthcare workers that are already, on the front lines of fighting this virus, being exposed every day to people who might have it.
Yeah. So one of the things here that we've kind of run into is these companies kind of were ramping up their production, their creation of these tests. And then the Food and Drug Administration stepped in. So can you talk a little bit about what the Food and Drug Administration has said? Have these been outright bans? How is this working? And why has the FDA kind of stepped in to say, hold on?
Yeah, so it's a little complicated. So we know, of course, that testing around the country has been in short supply for the coronavirus. There are a lot of people who think that they might have COVID-19, aren't getting tested. There are long lines for testing. There are people who have, confusion about where to go if they have symptoms, things like that. We are starting to see a ramping up of testing around the country, thanks to a lot of diagnostics companies that are shipping millions of kits all over the country, but it's still really not enough right now. The FDA last month in February came out and said, look, we know that we're going to need more testing. And so the FDA basically started letting a bunch of commercial and academic labs develop their own coronavirus tests. Now, so these startups, the ones that I mentioned, Carbon Health, NewRx, Everlywell, a couple of other companies took this to mean that, hey, we can start providing these tests too. And these companies actually were set to send out thousands of these tests. Would have been, a drop in the bucket compared to what is really needed in terms of testing capacity all over the country. But it was still, a little bit of help. Like everything helps, right? So these companies last week were actually set to start selling these tests directly to consumers. And then on Friday, the FDA put out kind of a harshly worded statement saying that these tests were not authorized. They had not authorized at-home testing. And in fact, the notice that the FDA put out back in February did not apply to at-home testing. So these companies sort of jumped the gun. There was some confusion about, what actually the FDA meant by this notice. And so now these companies it seems like they're trying to work with the FDA to figure out a solution to get their tests out to people. But as you mentioned, the important thing about testing right now is prioritizing the people who really need it. And that means the elderly, people with underlying health conditions, healthcare workers, again, who are on the front lines and being exposed potentially every day to the virus. So I think there was a worry from the FDA, from health officials, that these companies might be selling these tests directly to people who don't need them. And obviously that doesn't help anyone, if people are buying these tests who just have a sniffle or have really mild symptoms and are really okay to just stay at home.
Yeah, now some of the companies have chosen to donate, I read that they were giving the test that they had to different healthcare officials that needed it. Is that something that we're seeing all of them do, or is that just kind of some of the companies like, okay, well, we've got these ready, so we might as well just hand them over?
One company, Everlywell, I mentioned, they had something like 40,000 tests available last week, and they said they're going to be giving all of these to healthcare workers and hospitals to really prioritize those folks who are at risk. And again, right now, one of the other problems with these tests is they're not validated. So we don't know, if a cheek swab, if a nasal swab that a person takes themselves is going to get an accurate enough results. We're talking about a person who is untrained doing this at home versus a healthcare worker who is trained to kind of do the swab in the correct way and know where to swab and how to do it properly in order to get the best sample possible. So that's the other concern with these tests right now, is that we just, I think the FDA just wants to make sure that these are going to work before, before letting these companies sell these tests directly to customers. And so, yes, Everlywell is going to be giving all of these tests to hospitals, healthcare companies, to just start testing the highest risk folks. And they did say that healthcare workers are going to be administering the tests first. But it does seem like the FDA is kind of leaving the door open for hopefully maybe in the near future having at-home tests be an option.
Yeah, I would hope so at some point. I also, would hope that it's done responsibly. Obviously, want something like this to be done responsibly before rolling it out on a mass scale. What comes to mind for me is, we're talking a lot about this social distancing and, limiting exposure to people if you happen to have the virus or not, making sure that you're not coming in contact with other people. When we bring samples and testing into the home and then distribute this through the mail, like, how is this done? How is that done responsibly? How is that done in a way that is attentive to the fact that I may have, I'm not saying I do, but I as a person in this world may have this virus. And when I'm literally putting a sample into the mail, there is the potential for that virus to spread, at least to some capacity. Is that being factored in here? That's probably part of the FDA's concern, at least a small part of it.
Yeah, that's a good question. The FDA in their statement last week didn't provide a whole lot of details, so I'm not privy to what the FDA is kind of saying about these tests behind closed doors. But there was just a study out that showed that the coronavirus can last on different surfaces for quite a long time. So on cardboard, it was something like 24 hours the virus could stick around, and on plastic, it was even longer at 72 hours. So that does sound like a long time, but again, the virus particles kind of degrade over time. So, but certainly that still is a consideration and could still be a biohazard. So hopefully the companies that are thinking about producing these tests would be factoring that into the design of their kits. You would maybe take a swab and stick it in a plastic tube that goes inside a sealable envelope that then goes inside of another envelope or plastic bag, something like that. But certainly there is a concern that putting something like this through the mail could potentially infect someone if you put it in the mail and then your postal service worker takes it, for example. There's been a lot of concern about postal workers and their safety handling mail during this time. So that's definitely a concern.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what the future looks like here. Are we eventually going to see at-home testing become available, and how far away is that precisely?
I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't answer those questions directly. I don't have a crystal ball. But what I can tell you is the Trump administration has been saying for the past couple of days that self-swab options are going to become widely available soon at these drive-through test centers all across the country. So this is probably going to be the first step toward at-home testing. Instead of driving up to one of these testing sites and having a healthcare worker swab the inside of your nose, they will instead hand you your own swab, and then you'll do it yourself, and then you'll put it in a bag, and then that is also to cut down on exposure to healthcare workers. We're hearing a lot right now about personal protective equipment, or PPE, and how this is in very short supply, and people are trying to think of ways to conserve this really valuable PPE, and doing the self-swab test is one of those ways. So we're definitely going to see that as a first step. We might see, in a couple of months, when sort of this first wave of the outbreak kind of died down, maybe when you have a situation where there are much smaller outbreaks, maybe at-home test kits will become available for the masses. There is a project in the Seattle area right now. It's a research project, so this is different from these commercial efforts. There's a research project that is going to be delivering at-home test kits to some folks in that area. And I believe they've already reached capacity because there were just so many people interested in participating. The Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is also looking into how to scale this. And as you said, Jason, trying to figure out the best possible way to do this responsibly, get it out to the people who really need it most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. Well, Emily Mullin, I want to thank you for joining us today. Of course, folks can check out Elemental over on Medium for all sorts of science news. But if folks want to follow your work online, how can they do so?
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter at Emily L. Mullin, and I will also put in a plug for Medium's coronavirus blog. It's just coronavirus.medium.com, and we are updating that constantly several times a day and pulling in, all sorts of posts and stories and great content across Medium as well as from other publications about the pandemic.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We do appreciate it, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily.
Stay healthy.
Take care. Be safe. Yes.
You as well. Yes.
You too.
All around. All right. So you may not have been very familiar with Zoom prior to the pandemic. Chances are you've heard about it since then, though. It seems like everybody's talking about Zoom. Very likely you've maybe even been on a call through the video conferencing service. Quickly, in a very short amount of time, it's become the go-to tool for people suddenly finding themselves, working from home, kind of like we're doing right here for the first time in their careers. That's good for Zoom's business, of course, but there may be some reason to be at least hesitant or concerned about what's going on behind the scenes about our sudden reliance on the platform. And joining us to talk about the data and privacy policies of Zoom is Mehreen Kasana from Input. Welcome to the show, Mehreen.
Thank you for having me.
It is great to have you on today. Thank you so much for taking the time. So first of all, I know I had used Zoom a handful of times prior to now. Now I feel like it's total, it's almost becoming a verb at this point, kind of like Google, just Zoom me. I'm hearing everybody talking about Zoom. Were there broad concerns about what was going on behind the scenes as far as the policies driving Zoom prior to the coronavirus response, or has this really heightened awareness around, okay, wait a minute, there's something to look at here?
Well, I think in 2019, as I mentioned in our report at Input, the Electronic Privacy Information Center filed an official complaint with the Federal Trade Commission alleging that Zoom bypassed browser security protocol by accessing webcam content. So the complaints were there. Anecdotally, I used it when I was working at a startup in the Lower East Side in New York. And if you went on Reddit, you could see complaints here and there about Zoom's privacy policies. But I think what happened was after the pandemic broke, Zoom's user base, the daily user base, we've also reported this at Input, shot up by 67%. So I think people went from that general understanding we have that says, if it's free, you're the product, you're the currency, from that to seeing the cracks in the system. And it's just followed this very straightforward formula of more attention, more users, more attention to the cracks in the system. In this case, Zoom's privacy policy became a lot more apparent just because of sheer use. People at the Washington Post brought it up, we brought it up, and I think it's like, before this it didn't really see the day of light because it was lesser known, it was not exactly that famous, but now that with people using it so much, people are looking at the problems and they're thinking, okay, there's something wrong here and we should talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there are particular features? I know one of them is this attention feature that knows when you've switched away from the video for a certain amount of time, and it reports this back to the administrator of the video. Are these the features that people are concerned with, or is there something kind of deeper from a data collection standpoint happening?
There are several things that come to mind that I think are worth keeping an eye on. There's one that I mentioned in our report, the attention tracking tool, which alerts your administrator, otherwise the host, that you did not have Zoom's window in for about 30 seconds. And that, again, depends on the level of service, the tier of service you have. If you have a corporate account, your host will know if you're not looking at the screen. That's such a very arbitrary ground to work on because, there are like 100 of reasons why you're not looking at your screen. It doesn't have to be just you slacking off. The other thing that does come up is, as Sean O'Brien from Yale Privacy Labs mentioned, the ability of administrators to dial into a call whenever they want of that organization. They have the autonomy to do that. They can just interrupt in a meeting and get into that without the say of the others. And then the third feature that I think is worth looking at, apart from the others, is the fact that, again, depending on the level of service you have, you can record a meeting and transcribe the content of that meeting and then distribute the content of that meeting to other people beyond the meeting without the explicit knowledge, permission, or consent of the attendees. So these three things come up, but it's also Zoom's data collection model is not exactly made transparent and apparent to the people that use it. And so those three tools, along with its extraction model, I think they're worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah, and like I find myself a little torn because I'm like, on one hand, like, when you work for an organization and let's say all of your email, as one example, is filtering through an organization, like I've always just kind of assumed, okay, look, my email's passing through the company. There is little for me to like grab onto that says that I have like 100% privacy through this. I am, after all, using their systems. So I just kind of assume that they have access to this. But it's an assumption that I make. And certainly that's true depending on where you work. In the case of Zoom, is any of this being communicated outside of the EULA, and maybe it's not even explicitly listed in the EULA in the terms of service, but is there any way really for employees to know that a manager could just suddenly drop in on their private conversation at any time without the company making that explicitly known to the employees? Zoom isn't doing it, right?
No, so the problem, this is a really good point that you mentioned. The problem with Zoom is much of its structure centers on giving explicit knowledge to the hosts, and the attendees don't really get to know. They learn later on. So your attendees will not know until much later on after everything has happened. That's how it goes there.
Okay, well then that's why reporting like what you're doing at Input is very important, at least for people to kind of get a better sense of this tool that they might be leaning on. Another kind of a group of people who are leaning on this very heavily are students.
Yes.
I know, I've heard of a number of schools in the area that have shut down that have moved their curriculum to being taught through Zoom. And so then I take, students younger than 18 using these services, definitely not reading any sort of terms of service or really knowing what's going on behind the scenes. If us adults don't know this, they probably don't know it either. Like, how do those worlds collide? Because there are protections for kids when it comes to technologies online.
So I think before I answer that question, that's a really good question. I think it's worth mentioning here. Nearly everything we use right now in this day and age, whatever app we're using, a platform, network, we all have our own personal threat models, right? So you and I, when we use Twitter, we understand that Twitter has some questionable privacy and ad policies, but we use it nonetheless because we have weighed out the pros and cons according to our personal threat models. And so the idea, the purpose of even talking about Zoom here, of even writing about it in Input that we have repeatedly, is not to say that it's inherently evil or incapable of doing good. It's to say that when you bring students in, and like you mentioned, these kids don't really read the terms of service. I mean, I have to be very frank, I really don't either. When you bring kids into this, we're talking about several things here. Zoom's business philosophy seems to be modeled around this this idea of testing the limits of what you and I find socially acceptable, right? So under pandemics and under unprecedented conditions like this one, rules can be bent, rules can be broken. And so right now, this is a make or break moment for all of us where we can put pressure on Zoom and say, when it comes to students, you need to be explicitly clear about what's being extracted, what's being accessed. In this case, we are not sure if teachers are being safe about sharing data on Zoom. For instance, and this is really alarming, students' progress reports, their behavioral disciplinary information, their mental health information, medical information can be shared on these places. And if they fall into the hands of third-party affiliates, we don't know how they can manipulate that and if that indeed could jeopardize a child's future. So the reason why we're kind of amplifying privacy concerns is because students at this moment are in a very vulnerable, very unparalleled, unprecedented situation, especially concerning preschoolers and kindergartners. They're using this too. I have a niece who's using Zoom right now. So just to go to the question that you said there, when it comes to students and Zoom, I think there's two things that needs to happen. One, students need to know that they have two legislative federal laws in place for them to protect them. And that is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA. And then the other one is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA. And COPPA is for children below the age of 13, whereas FERPA is for protecting the educational progress reports and data of students above that age. So I think it's very important for Zoom to give us an explicit statement, a legally binding statement saying that we follow these rules and the students' data is completely protected, because if we don't, we're kind of in a blind world right now. Does that make sense? So the idea has to, so what I want to say, yes, we do have legal protections. However, they need to be much more contemporary. They need to evolve according to the times we are in right now. To my knowledge, in the years that I've lived on Earth, we haven't been here before where we've had a predominantly virtual, remote classroom world right now because of what we're going through. So I think the laws need to reflect that particular condition. And to that end, I think we need to go beyond FERPA and COPPA, and we need to have security and transparency reports from Zoom that reveal, authentic, real-time proof of sound, foolproof infrastructure and security architecture, and also legally binding statements that if I don't abide by XYZ, there will be legal consequences. So that's why I think the concern right now about Zoom is pretty justified, especially when you consider that there are children using this.
All right, and finally, Mehreen, are there steps that people can take? Like if you absolutely have to use Zoom, say, for the school or your company is using it, are there steps that people can take to better protect themselves from some of the stuff that's happening behind the scenes, protect their data, protect their privacy? What do you have to say about that?
So there are steps that you can take. The problem with Zoom and practically any other, Microsoft does this too, and we have issues with Google Hangouts. So all these technologies do have certain steps that you can take and protect yourself. For instance, and I really recommend this for everyone, whether they're a student or a colleague, whoever it is, to enable end-to-end encryption for your direct messages, because Zoom does, according to its privacy policies, it does extract what it calls customer content, and it does have access to your instant messages, and it does get into that. So the extraction model is pretty deep. For that, I think you should really, really enable your end-to-end encryption. You should also make sure that you have your consent enabled, which is, ironically enough, disabled by default. And that allows your administrator to record a meeting because you have it disabled by default. So you just need to go back in there and enable consent, and then they'll need your permission to record a meeting. And another thing I think is really important is to, if you can, and if your teacher, your boss doesn't want you to be on camera and on mic at all times, disable your mic and your cam if you're not saying anything. Definitely do that. And if you can't do that, if they want to see you, then try to reveal personal information as much as you can. They have an option for a green room, so to speak. Kids have been putting things in the background, and it's good to reveal that. Right now you have everything in the open, but if I were to be on Zoom, I would hide that. So there are steps in place, but it's also, I think, this is, like I said, an outbreak. I don't want to say this is a great time to be thinking about these things, but this is an opportunity of a make or break situation where we can apply a pressure and think in more proactive terms. Right now, what we do as a community, as a society, is that we kind of follow this apology-based data model where we find out that these companies have been mining data, they apologize, but the damage has been done. So I think we need to go past that and become more proactive, and kind of see those legally binding statements from these companies and say, there should be legal consequences for violating rules. But yeah, you have steps in place right now. You have end-to-end encryption, you have enabling the consent button, and you also have, revealing personal information that can mitigate manipulation chances and abuse chances.
All right. Well, Mehreen Kasana, really appreciate you taking the time. InputMag.com. Love all the work you guys are doing at Input. It's quickly become one of my favorite sources, so I appreciate your work. And thanks for taking time out of your day to join us. We appreciate it.
Stay safe.
We'll talk to you soon. Take care. Stay healthy.
You as well. Bye-bye. All righty. Well, chances are if you're listening to this, then you know a thing or two about podcasts. But something very exciting that's happened is that Google Podcasts is coming is here. It's here for iOS. And so we are very excited to talk to the founder and product manager of Google Podcasts, Zack Reneau-Wedeen, who's here with us today. Hello, Zack.
Hey, Mikah. Thanks for having me on. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, we are so pumped about this. So, I'm a native iOS user. I've used loads of different podcast apps, and I'm curious, what is Google Podcasts bringing to the iOS experience? What is it that makes Google Podcasts unique? What can it do for me as an iOS user?
So, I guess yesterday we kind of have 3 parts of the launch. The first is a little bit less relevant to iOS because it's our first launch on iOS, and that is a redesign of the app around discovery. And we can talk a little bit more maybe in the coming minutes about the podcast discovery problem. Mm-hmm. The second thing that we've done is just add a bunch of features. So the ability to queue up podcasts, the ability to turn on auto downloading, view your listen history, set up push notifications. These are all things that Google Podcasts for Android didn't have until this week, which is rolling out. I think it'll probably roll out to 100% by tomorrow. And so those are kind of the first 2 parts of the launch. But the third part is that Google Podcasts is available on iPhone for the first time. And we started working on podcasts a few years ago. We first launched Google Podcasts for Android in 2018. So you might be wondering why it took us almost 2 more years to release an iPhone app. And the reason is that with the success that we saw in terms of growth and engagement in Google Podcasts for Android, we also saw a lot of people interested in listening to podcasts when they search on Google. We saw people listening to podcasts through the Google Assistant. And while there are 2 billion people around the world who have Android devices, and that's a massive opportunity, we also want to make sure that we're serving users who might have, let's say, a smart speaker like a Google Home, but also an iPhone. Mikah, I'm sure since you host a tech podcast, your iPhone is probably not your only device that you have. Is that a fair assumption?
That is an absolutely fair assumption. As I look around and see all of these devices listening.
So for someone like you might listen to podcasts that are over an hour long. You might want to start one on your computer, pick up on your phone. You might be cooking dinner and you want to ask Google Assistant to play your podcast and pick up where you left off. And so, especially for podcasts, which can be such a rich, long form type of media, we want to make sure that any user, whether they're using Google for all of their devices or just for some of them, can use Google Podcasts. So that's a big part of it. The other part of it, honestly, is on the publisher side too. If you're going to have your podcast on Google Podcasts and you want to tell users where they can get it, you want to make sure that player is universally available. And we have a pretty strong belief. It's, one of the words in Google's mission is universal, making the world's information universally accessible and useful. And so we feel like podcasts are a universal medium the same way as radio. And so it's not just sort of tactical, it's also bubbles up to a higher level of strategy for podcasts, but also for Google as a company.
Excellent. Now, one of the things, the first thing you mentioned in the article, and I was kind of reading along and going, yes. You say it took me a decade to find the podcasts I love most. And so one of the features that Google Podcasts is rolling out is a way that makes it easy for you to find shows that you will genuinely enjoy. And I'm curious, does this go down to the episode level? Is it a podcast as a whole kind of recommendation? And do you want to just talk about this feature in general and why you're so excited about it?
Yeah, so I mean, you can see from the blog post, this was kind of a fun blog post to write for me because it also allowed me to kind of take a trip down memory lane and think about what I was listening to 10 years ago, 5 years ago, when I think getting into podcasts was really required a different level of energy. But it still requires a lot more energy, I think, than getting into YouTube or Twitter or Instagram or these services that have really figured out discovery to a much greater degree than we have in podcasting. And so if you'd asked me 2 years ago when we first launched Google Podcasts on Android, I would sort of have to talk my way around the fact that we did show recommendations primarily based on what else you were listening to, which is great once you get into podcasts because it says, oh, you listen to this, you might also like that. And those are good recommendations. But it doesn't address two things. The first one is that if you're not already into podcasts, there isn't necessarily a listening history with which to give you new recommendations. So it doesn't solve the cold start problem. And then the second thing is that when you operate at the show level, you actually miss out on a lot of relationships that could be formed between a listener and a podcaster. So to give you an example, there's a podcast that I used to listen to. I still listen to it sometimes, but it's called You Made It Weird with Pete Holmes. It's kind of like comedy, spirituality, culture, lifestyle, and he's very entertaining. He's a good host. And the reason that I got into that podcast is because he did an interview in particular with Aaron Rodgers, who's the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers. And I'm a sports fan. And so I was willing to dip a toe in and see, oh, who's this Pete Holmes guy? Because I was so interested in the interview with Aaron Rodgers. And they talked about all these weird things. I've talked about this before. They talked about trying the Impossible Burger and what Aaron Rodgers thought of that. And this was a few years ago, so most people hadn't tried that yet. And so then suddenly I was like, oh, this Pete Holmes guy is pretty interesting. And I ended up getting into the show. But that wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for getting the specific episode recommendation. So the way that we address these two problems with the launch yesterday is, number one, the same way you would get recommendations for articles to read through Discover, which is like the Google feed of articles, or through Google News. Also, your Google profile is taken into account when you first use Google Podcasts to try to connect you with podcasts that you'll like, even if you don't have a listening history already. And then the second piece of it is that we go straight to the episode. So we actually recommend specific episodes that we think you'll like.
Nice.
And that, I think, is a really good gateway to figuring out if you want to listen to a show. Whereas the prevailing paradigm before yesterday, I think, is that you would start from the most recent episode or the oldest episode. And that's not always the best episode to start with for each person. It's a much more personal problem.
Yeah, so I really like that, and to have it go to a specific episode is really nice. And I guess that's one of the questions I'm curious about. Does the discovery feature sort of improve over time in a way that it can continue to recommend, specific episodes based on, am I getting a better discover feature over time versus what it initially learns about me?
Yes. So the component that we talked about at the beginning, which is your listening history, is another component. And I think, while your interests are a great signal for what podcasts you want to listen to, there's not always a perfect overlap. To give you an example, I really like to listen to podcasts about sports, but I wouldn't necessarily say that in general, I want all my other content to be about sports also. So what happens for me when I'm a new user is I actually get suggested a lot of stuff that's about coding and programming. And this makes sense because that's what I'm into more generally. But oftentimes I like to use podcasts actually to take a break from that. And maybe if I'm going on a run or cooking and just zoning out for a bit. And so as you listen to more podcasts in the app, it'll be much more contextual for what you actually want for podcasts. Whereas the best guess when you just first start is going to be a little more generalized. So the short answer I would say is we try to do the best job we can when you don't have a rich listening history, but we also try to improve as you develop one.
One of the cool features that we see is being able to do Google searches, and you can, ask a question or look up a topic, and it will now start to take you directly to a point in a YouTube video where they talk about that specific thing. So it's sort of doing transcription and lets you do searches that way. Is this something that we'll see in Google Podcasts as well?
That's a really good point and an interesting observation. So it's useful in YouTube. The one that I've used the most often is how to tie a bow tie. I think the last few times I finally graduated to like the static image tutorial, whereas I needed like the full video. Right. But that one like jumps you to a specific point in the video where it's most useful to you. And that's definitely something that I think would be really useful to bring to podcasting as well. And one thing that's important to highlight there is that process requires a lot of input from publishers. So as we develop more of these features that take the technology to the next level, we're also talking a lot with publishers and working with them to make sure that we're doing it mindful of the way that they've artfully constructed their content, the way that they sustain a business with their listeners and their long-term goals. So I think it's similar to YouTube in terms of some of the use cases that we can have, but also a situation where in the open ecosystem of podcasts, we want to make sure that we're proceeding at the right pace and working with publishers closely to build features that are great for users and also great for publishers, because you really need both in order to take the ecosystem to the next level and sustain the growth that we've been so delighted to see over the past few years.
Absolutely. Does Google Podcasts on either platform have an import feature? A lot of people, will be coming from other apps, other podcast apps and things like that, and may want to try this out. Is this a situation where you will just go and find the podcast that you like and subscribe? Or is there some sort of import feature of the list of podcasts that you listen to in other apps?
So our goal since the beginning has been to introduce hundreds of millions of people around the world to podcasts. And we recognize that the vast majority of those people will not have listened to podcasts before. And so we've thought a little bit less about the experience of switching from an app. And I think yesterday when we launched on iOS, it actually forces us to think a little bit more about that switching experience, because podcasts are a little bit more prevalent on iPhone in terms of the percentage of users who are listening to podcasts. And so we want to make that switching process as easily as possible for people who want to switch. But we're always still going to be focused on users who we can introduce to podcasts and where we can really grow the pie in general. So the short answer to your question is we don't currently have an import feature within the app. What I've found since I've set up a lot of new accounts over the past few months is that the other feature that we have launching this week is the ability to subscribe and manage your subscriptions on the web. And I found that compared to the OPML export, OPML import flow in a lot of apps, it's pretty similarly time consuming if you have, less than 100 subscriptions. Maybe it's more like less than 30 to just search on podcast.google.com for the name of the podcast and then subscribe. And that takes, less than 5-10 seconds per podcast if you have the list in front of you. So if you have, 100 podcasts, you're talking about a little less than 10 minutes probably, which sounds like not that much time when I say it, but I also know as a user that it feels really annoying to have to do things manually. So I'm not trying to make excuses. And I wish actually that there was an even more seamless way to switch between apps than OPML, which I think is somewhat difficult.
Right. It's complicated. Yeah.
And also it's not friendly to people who aren't really tech savvy. So one idea I've had that I've been plugging a lot internally, maybe plugging it externally will help us actually build it, is what we should do is, maybe someone else will do it too. That would be cool as well. But hopefully this lights a little bit of a fire. We should be able to import based on any screenshot of cover art. So you can just go to your library, take a screenshot, go to another app, upload the photo. So I only mention that to say that we've been thinking about it a lot and how to make it more approachable for newer users. And we want to see the industry move forward in general, make it easy for users to choose where they prefer to listen across their devices.
Yeah, that's a wonderful idea. Just the thought of, okay, I go into my my Apple Podcasts library where I can see all the different little squares. I take a screenshot and then that uploads into the Google Podcasts and can automatically subscribe. I will say though, as I'm doing this, I'm finding it handy to be able to prune my very long list of podcast subscriptions down to ones that I actually want to listen to. So there is a little bit of a benefit to doing that manually that I was not expecting. So that's kind of fun. I do appreciate that.
There's another thing that kind of gets into one of the principles of our product that I feel comfortable saying is a long-term principle, which is in podcasting, if you have like 200 subscriptions, it starts to feel like you're managing it and like it's a lot to manage. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look at the way that we've designed the app as of yesterday, what you'll see is that it's designed around making it so that there's never an increased management cost for you because you subscribe to an additional podcast. And if you think about the way you use Twitter or Instagram or YouTube, if you follow 1,000 people or 10,000 people, that doesn't make the experience more clunky and harder to manage. And so we're trying to bring that same level of flexibility to the podcast app because I think most podcast apps right now, they feel best when you have between maybe 10 and 50 subscriptions, but they start to get unwieldy after that. And we've seen such an explosion in the number, variety, and quality of podcasts available over the last 5 years that we don't want you to have to think, oh, do I have too many subscriptions? We want to manage that smartly for you and help you find the content you love most as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I have one final question for you. I know we got to let you go. A lot of folks right now are sort of focusing more time. They're spending more time at home. They're spending more time away and are not necessarily doing the commute that tends to be the standard method of for at least folks that I know, their podcast listening. And so I'm curious, as a person who's steeped in podcasting in general, and as you in your blog post, you shared about how you have found podcasts in the past and looked to podcasts. What does the current state of sort of podcast listening look like in your mind? How are we listening, and where are we listening? And maybe if you want to give us a little glimpse into your life, how and where are you listening to podcasts?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the blog post because writing that, I got into podcasts while I was in my car, like originally, but then thinking about the activities today that are best suited for podcasts, going to the gym is not something that we're really doing anymore, but cooking dinner might be. And it depends where you are, but going on a run is something that you can still do. And so it's been pretty interesting to see how when people are turning to podcasts and how they're turning to podcasts in these strange times. And one thing that's true that a lot of people, I think, don't know is that most podcast listening, or at least the plurality of podcast listening, was already taking place at home. So there is a pretty big base there. And I think what we've seen is obviously a decrease in podcast listening during commutes, since people aren't really commuting, at least, people who aren't going into work are not commuting. And some level of increase in terms of interest in the news, interest in finding authoritative content about what's going on with COVID-19. And so I think we feel a sense of responsibility there in a couple ways. Number one is for people who are interested in finding authoritative, relevant, informative podcasts about what's going on in the world. We want to help them stay informed. And I think you'll see that in the product. And then also for probably a majority of people who actually want to use podcasts as a little bit of an escape, because I think there's a mental health crisis that is not of the magnitude of the public health crisis that we have right now, but is still worth taking very seriously. We want to be able to give them a way to just, spend 30 minutes, spend an hour doing something that was normal before the past month, or in certain parts of the world, the past few months. And so that sense of responsibility, I think, also makes us passionate about getting the new redesign out the door, getting the app out the door on iOS, and just having podcasts available to people. One example for me is I often fall asleep with a podcast on. If I'm reading a book, that's a nice way to fall asleep. And you can kind of turn out the lights in a way where I have to keep a light on if I read a book. So that's something that I've been doing where, maybe before I would listen to a particular podcast while commuting, and now I save it for right before bed. What about you? I'm curious your behavior as well.
Yeah, so I was the right before bed thing, definitely. I routinely fall asleep to podcasts and then sort of pick them up where I left off in the morning, finish them out while I'm getting ready in the morning. Showers, another great time. I'm sort of a connoisseur of fine Bluetooth waterproof speakers because I love to listen to music and podcasts in the shower, and walking the dog and things like walking the dogs rather and things like that. So yeah, there are plenty of places to still listen to podcasts. And for the folks who are listening to this one, listening to this great interview we've had with you, I'm sure they've got just as many fun places to listen to shows. And like you said, whether you're finding an escape or you are looking for authoritative information, podcasts can be great for that. Zack Reneau-Wedeen, I want to thank you so much for taking a little bit of time out of your day to join us here. It was fun hanging out from our respective locations, so we do appreciate you coming. If people want to follow you online, check out your work, where do they go to do that?
Twitter is probably best. I'm just at ZackRW, it's ZACKRW, and I think it'd be fun to hear what sort of innovative methods people are trying to listen to podcasts these days, since we're a little bit more homebound, and how they're kind of changing up their behavior. So we always like feedback, I think, whether it's just fun anecdotes or sincere product requests. So happy to connect with anyone.
Awesome. Well, thank you so very much for joining us.
Cool. Thank you, Mikah.
All right. Well, thank you, Zack. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening in whatever way you choose to continue listening to our podcast. We do appreciate it. Tech News Weekly publishes every Thursday at twit.tv/TNW. That's where you can go to subscribe to the show. That's where we encourage you to go to check out all past episodes, but mainly subscribe. So maybe you're subscribing in Google Podcasts. I don't know. But whatever podcatcher you use, twit.tv/TNW to subscribe. Of course, you can be a part of the show by emailing us. It's tnw@twit.tv. And of course, follow us on social media, because we are doing AMAs. We're doing live stuff. We're doing it all. And so you want to make sure to stay up to date with that. Yeah, heck yeah. So do that by following us on Twitter @twit. You can follow us on Instagram @twit.tv. We are also on TikTok @twittalk. And of course, if you want to tweet at me, I am at Mikah Sargent on pretty much all of the social things. Of course, be sure to check out and subscribe to Hands on iOS. Your subscription means so much to us. You subscribing keeps the lights on for us in our respective locations just as much as it does in the studio. So please do subscribe to the show. Download it if you want to in the new Google Podcasts. But Hands on iOS, there's a new episode publishing later today. And so you're going to want to check that out. And of course, that is actually all that I want to say. So Jason, it's your turn. Of course it is. You can find me on Twitter @Jason Howell. Also Hands on Android. Hands on iOS is fantastic, but Hands on Android is another one that you can check out. twit.tv/HOA. New episode published today on Android 11 Developer Preview 2 that just came out late last week, so you can check out all the new features, how Android 11 is bubbling up at this point. Thanks to everyone in the studio who helps us do this show, particularly today is John and Burke, and I think that's it. We keep the studio pretty empty these days for obvious reasons. And thanks to you for watching and listening each and every way. Yes, I hope so. It better be. 6 miles might be better. Thanks for watching and listening. We'll see you next week on Tech News Weekly. Bye, everybody.